Hey everyone, it's Dan. Welcome back. This is going to be another painting video. Not really tutorial, more ramble, I guess, than tutorial. Unless you're trying to follow along here. There's some paints in the back. That's what I'm going to be using. This is going to be in my patent pending Razzle Dazzle style, which is going to involve mostly just blocking out colors. We're going to do a dry brush of brighter colors, principally white, and then like a little dot highlight followed by a very, very heavy wash. And I've found, maybe if you've seen some of my prior painting videos, that it leads to a pretty cool effect. Something kind of in between dipping and slap chop, kind of a gritty effect at the end. As I said, so here are the paints that I'm laying out here. This is actually the second unit that I'm painting for my Carthaginian army. And I thought about kind of creating this as a log as well, because I've found those are somewhat popular. And I realized that I can kind of do both. I think if I just update you on the overall progress of the army at the very end of the video. Those who are looking for kind of painting ramble content can have that, and then people who are looking for log army progress content can have that. So that's what you'll see at the very, very end of this video, is just where the army stands, which is not very far along yet, but we'll get there. The miniatures I'm using here are mostly from Victrix. They're kind of a blend of Carthaginian, it's from the Carthaginian box. They have Libyan skirmishers. I guess I didn't even realize, you'll maybe know from the video title, but I'm painting Libyan skirmishers. I realized I didn't even say that. But they're a mix of manufacturers, mostly Victrix, blend of a couple of different poses and sculpts. But there are also some War Games Atlantic figures in there from their Citizens of Rome box. So I just blended a whole bunch of them together. And then I've got them on these 60x4 and 40 millimeter bases that I'm using probably for Hail Caesar. I don't even know what game system I'm going to use these for, but this is what I'm basing all my Carthaginian units on. These 60x40, but because these are skirmishers, I'm putting 4 on these bases instead of 6. So in terms of color blocking here, I'm going with very dark skin tone. And I'm using scorched brown, or excuse me, Rhinoxide, old scorched brown. I keep mixing those up. So I went through and blocked out Rhinoxide as the base color for all the skin. I wanted a very rich, dark skin tone, as these are North African Javelinmen. And in doing research actually for this painting project, I realized, and I hope somebody with more historical experience than I can answer this question, but I realized I didn't really understand the difference between Numidians and Libyans, that they're both North African. Like Numidia, as I understand it, was a kingdom during the time of Carthage, and so it was all North African along the Mediterranean, but Libyans as well. So at first I thought that we were talking about an ethnic group versus a geographical region, but it doesn't seem that that's the case. So if anybody knows the difference, please drop a line below, because I would also like to make a unit of Numidian cavalry at some point for this unit. So I blocked out the skin. I used that very dark skin tone. I used black for the hair, and then I'm going in with 4 tunic colors. You saw me display them just a moment ago, just kind of various shades of brown and beige. And it's funny, I had originally thought I was going to do one of each color on each base, but I realized humans, I guess, are very good at recognizing patterns. And so I originally was going to go through and do, as I said, one on each base, but for some reason I had it in my mind as soon as I was starting to do that even if you mix the colors up on the base, I felt like I would be able to notice what I did there. So what I decided to do here, you can see I'm using 2 of the same color on one base. Otherwise, it was 1 color per tunic on each base. And I think just that simple break in the pattern was enough to where I don't notice anyway. Maybe I wouldn't have noticed before, but I was very fearful that I was going to notice a pattern there. So I think, yeah, just over 3 bases, 12 models. Basically, you're painting each tunic 1 time, except for on one base, I'm painting 1 tunic twice. And then, of course, 1 color would only get used 2 times instead of 3 times mathematically. But that seemed to be enough to vary up the pattern. Mostly tunics on these guys. In all the prior painting videos we've done, we would start with metal, because that's usually like a lot of chainmail and stuff is what's covering the bodies of the miniatures I paint. However, in these cases, the reason I started with the skin and then working up to the tunic is because I'm trying to block out whatever color is the most predominant on the miniature is what I tend to go with. So yeah, just choosing different tunic colors here, working across the bases, one at a time. And then, yeah, other than that, other than the skin and the tunics, you can see these are pretty straightforward figures. From here, we're going to paint the belts. We're going to paint the javelins and then the shields. I've got a pretty cool cowhide design that I want to try out that we'll get. And there's some metal bits and bobs, like gold and whatnot, but certainly nothing like chainmail. If you see my prior videos too, the Hannibal's Veterans would have been, I guess, the first installment, if we're calling this a log series of this army. And I like to mix up belt colors too. I use different dark colors for browns, but with these guys, because they already had various like brown tunics, their skin tone is a very dark brown color. I decided I was going to use Doom Bull brown for leather, for belts, for any like sandals, stuff like that. Both because it is a reddish brown color, which gives a nice kind of color variation there, and also because it ends up being a somewhat unifying color for these miniatures that otherwise are wearing different tunic colors and don't really have any non-neutral colors on them. So going through just lining those out, there's actually not a whole lot of like belts on these miniatures either. They're mostly tunics. So these all have, or almost all have, this kind of crossbody strap holding a sword. A couple of them have belts going across the body, but other than that, pretty straightforward process. Xandri dust, if you've watched my prior videos, you'll know this is my go-to for all spear shafts, things like that. I found actually that AK acrylic color is a pretty good proxy for this. That's I think it's called beige, as kind of a sandy brown color. But I think this is excellent. I don't know why I ever settled on this. It must be because going back into like 6th edition Warhammer, the Dogs of War pikes, I think that is the color, something very close to it because it didn't exist at the time, but that kind of like yellowish brown color is what they used. So in my mind, that just seems like the correct color for spears. So I use it on the back of shields as well. But as a result, this color is pretty much the only one I think that's like earmarked where it doesn't go anywhere else except for on spears, backs of shields. Like you'll never see that color on a tunic anywhere. And then there is a bit of metal on these miniatures. I'm using lead belcher for the spear tips or the javelin tips there and just blocking that in. But otherwise, there's not much in terms of like iron color. So I'm going to do that. These actually ended up being more time consuming than I thought. I guess it's all relative, but because every javelin has the tip and the back of the javelin have a metal piece to it. So I found, and that's generally what I'm doing. You can see I'm kind of rotating the models. I decided to paint them on these bases instead of on like little popsicle sticks like I did for Hannibal's Veterans because they're spaced out enough that I thought I could kind of dart in between with the brush, and I really didn't find that it was problematic having 4 models on these larger bases. But yeah, I'm basically just rotating the whole base in my hand and picking things out. The only disadvantage to this, it's faster to do it this way for sure. The only disadvantage I found is that I was more prone to missing things and having to go back. Like here you can see I'm using Retributor armor to pick out the hilts of the swords, but I found like in several cases I missed it and I had to go back and then add it in. So little things like that, but otherwise this was very handy to not have to like paint on a popsicle stick and then separately glue them onto the base once everybody was painted. I used AK acrylics, I think it's rusty brass or something like that for the helmets. So there's 3 of them that have like kind of bronze helmets, so a little bit darker color than the Retributor armor that, as I said, I'm putting on the hilts of swords. There's actually quite a bit of like gold baubles, like bracelets and earrings, things of that nature on these figures, which is great. I don't know if they're like supposed to be gold, but I've mentioned before too that I'm a fantasy gamer primarily, so I like using gold as an accent color. So you'll end up seeing that on my miniatures a lot more than maybe you should historically. So we're on to the shields now. I said I'm going to use kind of a cowhide design here. There are actually transfers from Little Big Men Studios for specific shields that I think look very good. And as an American, though, I'm going with kind of like a Holstein cow design, so white and black. But I think probably historically they would have had like browner colors. I think that's what's used on the Little Big Men transfers. But I think this will provide a nice contrast of color as well. So the shields were already white. I'm still going in with pure white and doing a thin coat of that. And you can see what I'm doing. I'm taking then a Baden black and I watered it down pretty substantially, probably like 50-50 water and paint. And I'm going in and putting these random designs. I found that like the best practice is not to overthink it. You just kind of wiggle the brush in like roughly a like cow patch, maybe a Dalmatian design. I don't really know what I'm doing there, but it looked all right. But because the paint is so watered down, what it's doing is flowing quite well, and it also like dries in an irregular pattern, so it leaves behind kind of gradient of color that I thought looked pretty cool as well. And then we're going to ultimately wash these with Agrax Earthshade, which is going to add even more color variation to these shields. So that's what I'm doing here, watered down black, just kind of doing little wiggle movements on the shield to create kind of, you can see, I don't know what you would call those, little like patches or something like that. And then you want to go all the way over to the edge of the shield, because these in theory were hides stretched over wood. So that's what I'm doing. I'm taking it all the way to the edge of the shield. And then what I'm going to do once this dries is come back in with pure Baden Black, only slightly watered down. And then in certain areas kind of build the color up a little bit more. That's what I'm doing here, just taking almost out of the pot of Baden Black, building it up a little bit more. I've gotten criticisms in the past prior videos for not watering paint down, painting out of the pot. I do water the paints down a little bit in the pots, just so we're clear. But I edit it out for the most part. I'm constantly dipping my brush in water. So it's not like I'm using chunky paint or anything like that. I've found it's just easier that way than using like a wet palette, just to kind of keep your brush at the consistency that it should be. And now we're into the Razzle of the Razzle Dazzle, which is the dry brush step. So this is a very, very whisper light dry brush of just pure white over all of the non-metal bits of the figures, which is most of the figures in these cases. And I stress light. This is like the lightest dry brush perhaps that you'll ever do. And you can see I'm kind of going over multiple areas like multiple times, and that's to build up color, because the key is when you go in and do this dry brush, you should almost see nothing happening the first time, and then as you kind of hover over that part of the miniature, you're gonna build color up, and you'll start to see little highlights getting picked up. So that's what you're doing here. I'm just kind of rotating around the figures here. This was probably the trickiest part of having the multi-based, was it was harder to kind of get the right angle for the dry brush part, but still, again, worth it in terms of time savings. And then once I've done this with all of these figures, I'm going to go back in with pure white and do kind of these little dot highlights, and just picking out the very, very uppermost raised edges of the figures, kind of highlighting the dry brush steps. Anywhere that got picked up by the dry brush phase, I'm going to kind of just do a little dot of highlight at the very uppermost part to suggest it's like a glint of sunlight. And it looks very cartoony and silly at this stage, because we're taking the contrast up to 11 here. But the final step here, which is this one, is you're going to use, this is mostly Agrax Earthshade, it says Seraphim Sepia, but we've gone from the lightest dry brush you'll ever do to probably the heaviest wash you'd ever do, which is, again, this is evolved out of using Army Painter Quick Shade, and I'm just using kind of a homebrew mix of Agrax Earthshade and some other stuff, and you're just going to dunk these miniatures in it. And the only exception to that is the shields. Any white areas, like pure white, like on the shields, basically I'm dipping it in the Agrax, and I dip the brush, like submerge it into water, don't swish it around, but you're going to heavily water it down that way. And you're going to use that over the shields, like you see me doing there, and then you're going to wick it away like immediately, because it'll start drying pretty quickly. Paying close attention to like the tops of the shields is kind of where I'm trying to pull it away from the most, and that creates kind of a natural highlight on the shields as well, but it also ensures that they don't become too dark. And then, yeah, you're going to go through and wash everything this way. Sort of the same principle applies to the figures. Once the wash is on, you're going to then, using a paper towel there, you're going to clean the brush off a little bit, and then you're going to try to wick away any excess that you don't need. What you don't want to have is any like pooling, especially on miniatures like this that have lots of cloth. It tends to cause pooling where you don't want it to, because it won't dry correctly if that happens. And then you'll let it dry totally. Usually let them dry overnight. And unusually for me, I don't typically come through and do this, but because there's so many folds, usually when there's like lots of just tunic, no metal, I like to come in with basically the same color I used to block out. This is sort of like a Games Workshop technique for their like working up the edge highlighting. But you can use that same color out of the pot after you've washed it to essentially highlight it. And it's a little bit different than usual, because I don't go all the way to the top, because that's where like the white is. So this is almost like a mid highlight. And then from there, you'll do a matte varnish, paint the eyes, and that's it. Here they are, finished and ready for battle. Again, probably in Hail Caesar, but we'll see. Pretty pleased with how these turned out. I think I'm going to do a video on Mediterranean bases like I have there. I have to finish up the other 12 Hannibal's veterans that are almost done. So I'll probably use those for a Mediterranean video. And there's the first 12 Hannibal's veterans, and now the 3 bases of Libyan skirmishers. Appreciate you dropping by for this one, guys. And until next time, happy gaming.